And finally, let's get to the third part of this exercise, how we will apply all these perspective rules in practice. When we have to model an object, as we said, we will have to first model it in a proportion, then bringing it to a scale, and then this object will be one-to-one to what we need. The most simple way to do this is to use plans or use projections. Let's try to analyze this using a real example. In the images or in the plans that we have, we got an armchair. I will load a 3D model of an armchair, so it's a lot easier to understand what I am trying to explain. Let's say, for example, we have to recreate this model. We have a project where this armchair will be used and we don't have the 3D model itself, but we got the plans. For example, in this case, we will use the 2D projection of this armchair. This is the most simple way if we got the dimensions and the plans. Of course, the most simple way is to just download it. Let's assume, for example, we don't have the model and the client demands that this armchair should be in our project. First of all, we should load our plans like we loaded our image on a plane. Same process like we did in the previous exercises. This will be like the first part, they will be in proportion, and then we will bring them to a scale using a reference, for example, a rectangle or a box. Using these dimensions, we will recreate this armchair using these plans. Of course, this is a more advanced model. This belongs to level 4 objects. We will begin our homeworks with more simple objects, with level 2 objects. But the things that link these two types of objects is the fact that they both got the perspective distortion. This perspective distortion interferes when we look at the object. Now, when we got the plans as a reference, we can avoid this distortion, this perspective distortion in the modeling process using real dimensions. That's why when we have the plans of the object, it's a lot easier to reconstruct or remodel this object from plans. But how we should act when we don't have these plans? Well, in this case, we will have to use the perspective techniques. It's okay if we have at least the overall dimensions of this object. But even if we don't, we will include this object into a box, visually of course. And then we will apply the principles that we had in the second part of this exercise. Same principles that worked with our cube. The horizon line, the vanishing points, and so on. Then we will turn visually our object from the same angle that it is represented on the image. And actually we will try to apply the same perspective rules, only in a more simplified way. As I said, we will not construct all these vanishing points, horizon lines, and so on. And finally, let's link all these three parts of our exercise together. I'll take the line construction that we had for our cube and I will try to apply the same things on this new cube, on this new chair, armchair. This new cube and this chair got the same angle, or at least the perspective distortion applies to them in the same way. They will actually represent any 3D model that we will have to model from an image. First of all, as I said, we will have to find the point of view. This is actually our point of view, our fixed point of view that we have in our random image that we will use for our models. And in a quick way, we will actually try to recreate the perspective construction. Yes, this will be a more simplified method that we will use for our 3D models. Still, in this simplified method, we will apply all these principles that we talked in this exercise, in this whole exercise. Although we will not draw our vanishing points, this does not mean that they are not there. The main thing that we will use will be our zero line, our measure tool. We will use, as we said, the closest to us edge, like the reference, and we will set the zero line, as we did in the previous exercise, underneath this closest to us edge. We will actually bring our model on the zero line on z-axis. I will show this in the next homework. And we will use this zero line both as the floor and as the measure tool. I know it seems a bit more complicated with objects than with cubes, but we cannot stick only to simple objects. We will have to model more complicated objects. In the next lessons, we will try to recreate all these models, all these simple models. This will be our first step into 3D modeling the second level objects. And step by step, you'll start to get used to it. And from the perspective basics and rules, this is all you have to know to start to model 3D objects. Okay, in the next lesson, we will try to recreate the first object from this list. And I invite you to follow along. We have to stick to our homeworks if we want to get good results.